In Volume 1 of this series, we discovered the Confiscation Act of 1862 and how it ultimately led to the Emancipation Proclamation, which many believe is what freed the enslaved black population of the South. However, in order for the proclamation to become the law of the land, the Union would have to win the war. Slavery was the central part of the American economy, and Southern slave owners were not going to let their cash crops go without a fight. More than 2 years would pass before emancipation meant anything in America, forcing millions of black people to continue living in the horrific conditions of slavery, unless you escaped. But escaping the South didn't always guarantee freedom. If captured, the punishment was sure to be harsh. Before Congress worked up the nerve to pass the Confiscation Act, the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 were the law of the land, and any slave caught trying to better their situation, that is, escape slavery, would be returned to their owner under the law. The Confiscation Act changed the war dramatically. Once enacted, slaves caught trying to escape could now be held as contraband, and even served militarily if possible. Being captured by the Union military became a commonly sought pathway to citizenship for enslaved black people. A treacherous journey, no doubt, but one that allowed those to fight for their freedom. Ask yourself, to what end would you go to secure your own freedom? In Wilmington, North Carolina, otherwise known as the Cape Fear, those wanting freedom had their work cut out for them. Since the Cape Fear was the lifeblood of the Confederacy, it was very heavily fortified. The journey would prove to be especially difficult for those seeking to leave. The most common route was to hide amongst the large cotton shipments or any shipment that was being transported out by Confederate blockade runners, or any ship that presented an opportunity. Either way it goes, there was great risk. For those that experienced chattel slavery, the decision was not by choice. During the formation of America's Constitution, the authors made a compromise in order to form a more perfect union. The compromise concluded that each state's representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College would be based on population. However, because Southern states had a massive amounts of slaves, other human beings being used as personal property, that is, this would certainly tip the scales in the favor of the South. So the population of each state's slaves could only be counted as a portion. This became known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. Legal precedent in the American judicial system is a decision that sets the legal standard of understanding so that cases going forward may be decided in a similar fashion. This is what's known as stare decisis. Those bedrock principles that were founded in law, in this case, the American Constitution, which is the oldest living legal document in our country, deliberately excluded those of African descent and indigenous descent. This precedent remained in place for over 100 years. The first Confiscation Act began to dismantle that legacy. However, the North would have to win in order to enforce any sort of policy that recognized black people as people. In the eyes of the law, that is. Changing the minds of the American people that had been taught for centuries that black people were only property would prove to take much longer. A few minutes ago, I asked you to what end you would go to secure your freedom. Now think about how you would react in a situation as bleak as this. This was the reality of black slaves here in Wilmington, North Carolina, as well as all over the South. If you could escape, maybe, just maybe, you could be a person in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. I'm not sure how many attempted the daring escape out of the Cape Fear and into the hands of the Union, but there are several success stories that I can share with you. Abraham Galloway was born into slavery on February 8, 1837 in what is now Southport, North Carolina. He was allowed to work in Wilmington as a brick mason or other skilled labor positions that he could find. It's here he would meet the friends that would be a part of his life forever, and here he would begin his transition to a free man. Among the friends that young Abraham met were William Benjamin Gould and George Price Jr. William Benjamin Gould was born into slavery in Wilmington in the same year as Abraham, 1837. Before the breakout of the Civil War, he worked as a plasterer, an area of craftsmanship which was very popular among black slaves. They called them artisans. In the context of antebellum architecture, the plasterwork was considered to be among the most complex. Definitely, the finished piece of plasterwork is what everyone would see, whether it be inside or outside of the buildings. Along with George Price Jr. and his father, Sr., this trio would go on to grace many antebellum South architectural and design entities with their elaborate ornamental work. In a time where American architecture, in regard to the American home, was largely just log cabins in the woods, these artisans used their skills and creativity to bring the designs to life. Much of their work still stands today and serves as a popular destination for tourists interested in antebellum North Carolina. But back to their daring escapes. Just before the war broke out in 1857, Abraham Galloway, along with a friend, Richard Eden, being super knowledgeable of the area, used their strengths to find their way to the Underground Railroad. They hid in a turpentine container stored aboard a ship that was headed north. To give you an idea of the type of person Abraham Galloway was, he was well aware of the chances that he could be stopped and found on his way out. Because the method of escape they used was so popular, the ships would constantly be stopped, and there was a method of smoking out the slaves, which was the process of burning the materials in the barrels that they normally hid in. But Abraham was prepared for this. He brought cloths along for the journey just in case they got smoked out along the way. Abraham told a homie Richard, like, yo, if they smoke us out, we got these cloths we're going to cover our face with. Whatever you do, don't jump up for fresh air. If you pass out, pass out. Wake up a free man. Probably. I don't know. I like to imagine that's what he told him. This ignited him to be hopeful for his future, as he was now able to travel north and secure his freedom. But young Abraham Galloway, just 20 years old at the time of his escape, did not forget about those he left behind in Wilmington, North Carolina. In 1863, he even managed to return to free his mother, Hester Hankins. Even though he was unable to read or write, Abraham Galloway became a fierce supporter of the abolitionist movement as well as the women's suffrage movement, recognizing early on that the oppression of any group intersects with the oppression of all people, and this directly cripples the fight for freedom of all people. He was an excellent speaker, and he used his passion and experience to deliver fiery condemnations of all those in favor of the institution of slavery, or any form of oppression. Frederick Douglass, who's someone you've undoubtedly heard of, worked closely with and introduced him as speaker at multiple events. Abraham Galloway went on to work as a spy for the Union Army throughout the Civil War, and he set up spy networks that proved to be very valuable for the Union Army. Once the war ended, he moved back to Wilmington, North Carolina to keep fighting for what he believed in: equal rights for all people, not just men, including the right to vote. In 1868, Abraham Galloway was elected as the Republican representative of New Hanover County in the North Carolina legislature. During his time as a senator, he advocated for the right for women to vote, an exercise in futility as his colleagues considered this suggestion too radical. There's so much more to learn about this American hero. Unfortunately, he died at the end of his first term as a senator in the year 1870. He was only 33 at the time of his death, and he passed away on his mother's couch in Wilmington due to a fever. Abraham Galloway not only impacted the lives of millions, but he continuously fought for their rights as free citizens. The homegoing service for Abraham Galloway was held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church on Market Street in Wilmington. More than 6,000 people attended the service. Unable to flee the South before the beginning of the war like Galloway did, William Gould and George Price Jr. would have to wait almost 5 years for their opportunity to escape. Undeterred, the two friends, along with 5 others, made their way down the Cape Fear River in a small rowboat that they found. No small feat by any stretch of the imagination, the river was littered with lookouts and other obstacles. They would have to plan this extensively in order to pull off the logistics of the mission. After successfully sailing past the vast defense checkpoints, the group was captured by the USS Cambridge, a Union Navy vessel patrolling the coast. After boarding the USS Cambridge, the men became contraband and ultimately free men of color. There's still so much red tape. Their knowledge of the intricacies of the Cape Fear made them valuable to the Union, which helped the sailors learn how to navigate many treacherous shoals and banks that can shipwreck the unaffiliated or the unfamiliar. After his capture, William B. Gould began to keep a very detailed diary of his experiences. His journal would go on to be a very important piece of not only his story, but the story of the enslaved black population of Wilmington, North Carolina. Although it was illegal for black people to read or write in this time period, Gould had very impressive penmanship. Not only did his journal prove that there was an underground educational community of Wilmington, but it illustrates just how effective the model of learning was, and how important the black community viewed education as a means for their progress. William Benjamin Gould had a profound knowledge of literature that could have cost him his life if said knowledge were ever to be publicly exposed. After leaving Wilmington, he moved to Massachusetts, where he and his wife, Cornelia Reed, a freedwoman also from Wilmington, raised a large family of men that continued the tradition of fighting for their country. As for George Price Jr., he and William Gould parted ways just 2 months after their escape from Wilmington. The journal entry from Gould on November 10, 1862, noted that his friend George went ashore with others and then disappeared along with 3 other men. Not to worry though, George Price then linked up with our good buddy Abraham Galloway in Beaufort, North Carolina, a Union stronghold deep within the Confederate territory. It was here where George Price Jr. got his start in political organizing, which he would then take his knowledge and know-how back to his hometown of Wilmington to continue advocating for the underprivileged black community. In 1868, George Jr. was elected to the City Board of Aldermen, where he served 1 year before being elected as a member of the House of Representatives. After that, George Jr. was elected to the North Carolina State Senate from 1870 to 1872. George Price Jr.'s resume is very thorough. I would be doing a disservice to his accomplishments if I attempt to list them. However, I do encourage anyone interested to do further research on this individual. You may be surprised what you find. George Price Jr. continued his work within the community of Wilmington all the way up until his untimely death at the age of 56, where he was struck by a train in the train yard on 2nd Street. Much has been mentioned about those that made the more than difficult journey out of Wilmington in an effort to flee slavery. That doesn't mean those who remained here didn't make strides toward the improvement of their situation. Once the Great War was over, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, which completely abolished slavery throughout the entire country. Unless... I digress. The end of slavery meant the beginning of Reconstruction. The Cape Fear would become a hub for progress during this period, probably the first of its kind after the Civil War completely decimated the economy. The growth experienced in this time by the black community of Wilmington came to fruition on the backs of this incredibly talented and hardworking community, one that understood not only the importance of its location, but the magnificence of its inhabitants. This growth would change Wilmington forever. This video has reached the end, but cool believe the puzzle of history is incomplete, and stories are lost all the time. That's why I'm encouraging you to talk to a neighbor or a friend about what they know about history. The journey of exploring history, rather local or on a world scale, does so much more than uncover hidden truths about your environment. Special thanks to the New Hanover Public Library and all of the historians that have preserved this information within these stories. Thanks to all of those that have wondered about your place and time, because it matters. I hope to continue delivering content like this and other methods that encourage community engagement. If you are interested in more, please subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the like button in the description. And again, thank you to everyone that made this video possible.